Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's July 26, 2024, and today we are speaking with Clare Hammond, author of the new book just published by Alan Lane, On the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar. Clare travelled by train around most of the country before the 2021 military coup, and tells her stories through themed chapters based on several train lines constructed either by the British colonists in the deep past or by Burma military generals in much more recent times. Clare dives into the backbreaking work that local communities were compelled to perform on these elite projects and ruminates on railways as state-building enterprises and white elephant projects in this deeply divided, war-torn society that is Myanmar in 2024. Hello, Clare.
Hi, Luke. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, before we call all aboard and set off discussing your new book, let's begin with the sleepers beneath the tracks, the story behind the story. How did you, Clare, come to Burma originally? How long did you spend in Myanmar? And why did you write this particular book?
So let me take you back. It was 2012 and I was working in Hong Kong as a financial journalist. And there was this huge buzz about Myanmar in the region. These economic and political transitions were taking place. No one really knew what was happening, whether it was really for real, because this kind of thing had happened a few times in the past before. And around this time, I had some friends who moved there from Hong Kong, and I went to visit them. And I traveled around the country, and I was totally hooked. There was so much energy, there was so much excitement. Aung San Suu Kyi had just been released from house arrest. She was sitting in Parliament representing her National League for Democracy party. And more than this, I was bowled over by the place itself. You know, the pace of life, the tea shop culture, the food. It was unlike anywhere, and this is a cliche, but it's true. It was unlike anywhere I'd ever been before. And I went back to Hong Kong, and pretty soon I found myself packing up everything into a couple of tiny suitcases and flying to Yangon. I almost didn't get in, actually, because I was planning to get a visa on arrival and my US dollar notes weren't crisp enough. Luckily, someone was able to get to the airport and slide more dollars under the barrier in the old airport that separated immigration from the arrivals lounge. So this gives you a flavour of how Myanmar was being run at the time. And I covered the election at the Myanmar Times, which at the time was a really good newspaper. It was staffed by some of Myanmar's best reporters and foreign journalists from around the world. And it was an extraordinary, electric and very hopeful time. Not for everyone, of course. The Rohingya notably had been stripped of their voting rights. But many people in Myanmar, I think, really did start to imagine a future that might be free from military rule. After the election, and this is 2016, I was wondering what my next steps would be, perhaps going back to the UK, perhaps going to another country. And I was thinking about doing a bit of traveling around Myanmar before I left. And I remember it really clearly. I was in the newsroom and I was reading this policy paper by the Asian Development Bank. They'd been working with Myanmar's railway ministry, and they'd uncovered all kinds of documents that had been sitting around on paper for decades. And they'd also digitized this map of new railways that had been built during the years of junta rule. And it showed that the country was absolutely covered with new railways. And I'd been living and working in Myanmar for a couple of years now, and I thought I knew the country pretty well. But I'd never heard of any of these railways, and neither, it turned out, when I started asking colleagues and other people, had anybody else. And for me, this was totally intriguing. So I packed up a tiny bag and I had a bit of time to spare and I saved up a bit of money, and I ended up spending 3 months traveling around the country, piecing together the story of why they were built. And I ended up staying in Myanmar for another 4 years. I didn't leave until 2020.
Right. And, growing up in many countries, we've got lots of options about how we get around, right? We can go on the road, we can do road trips, we can do train trips, we can fly, this kind of thing. When you were growing up, did you become a train person? Were you a train person before you wrote this book? And, the other thing is that Britain's kind of famous for train spotting, and there's all kinds of different words for this. People who are really, really into the trains. So how would you put yourself on a spectrum of train aficionado?
Yeah, you do see train spotters at railway stations all over the country with their notepads documenting when services get in. One reviewer of this book claimed that the book was very unusual in the British context, at least, because it's a book about railways written by somebody who shows no love for trains. And he was partly right. Right. When I was researching this book, I ended up speaking to a lot of railway enthusiasts. As you say, the UK is full of them. And I spent time in the archives of associations like the British Overseas Historical Railways Trust, whose members are mostly old white men. And they started out being thrilled that I was writing this book about Myanmar's railways because it's the first that's ever been written. And it's a big sort of blank spot in the railway archives. And then they quickly ended up being very disappointed that this wasn't a proper railway book. There are very few details in it about the tracks and the rolling stock. Actually, for anyone who's listening to this who is also disappointed, there is a proper railway book coming out later this year, and it's written by a German engineer called Dieter Hettler, who is in his 90s now, and he worked for many years for what was then Burma Railways as an engineer. But for all that, I do love traveling by train, and I hope that does come through. Like many Brits, they've always been a central part of my life. I used to take the train to school every day, and these are some of my happiest memories. And every year, my family would take the sleeper train down to the south of France on holiday. The train's actually how I've always got around. I only learnt to drive last year. And there's no better feeling, I think, than riding on Myanmar's trains for all of their troubled history. It's a really magical experience. And there's nothing like settling into a window seat with a book and a cup of sweet tea. And if you're lucky, a stick of freshly baked ichakwe and watching the world go by.
Well, that's an ideal scenario. Some of the trains that you describe traveling on really sound barely like trains at all, sort of in the cabin, of small little, I don't know how you describe them, locomotives, I suppose is a better term than a train. No passengers on them anyway. Was that interesting for you or slightly disconcerting, these improvised kinds of vehicles?
It was fascinating. I mean, you very quickly normalize it. The trains in Myanmar are old and some of them barely function. And there's this extraordinary variety of rolling stock. And the railway staff in Myanmar have been so inventive. Like some of the vehicles they have fashioned from the body and wheels of old Hino trucks. And they get around on little trolleys and so on. I loved the variety of it. I thought it was much more exciting to me than sitting in the luxurious Orient Express and passing smoothly through a world that you don't really get to engage with. This felt very exciting.
And they do have a real solidity, don't they? Like more so than a truck or something like that. Just the weight, and of course that means when they derail, things are often catastrophic. So the railways themselves, you mentioned the policy paper and the map you read that got you excited. So there's a spatial element to it, and you split the railways generally in the country into sort of ones that were built by the British and then ones that were built by the military. Is that the basic gist? Was there much construction in that brief 14-year period between colonial rule and military rule? What's the sort of general history of railway construction if you were going to plot it out over the 20th and 21st centuries?
So the first part of Myanmar's railway history took place during colonial rule. And then there was this very big break up until the early 1990s when the Than Shwe regime took power. after the uprising in 88. So the book is written in 3 sections. The first part is about the railways that the Than Shwe regime built. And after the British occupation, the state, led by Ne Win, had turned inwards. And during that time, multiple insurgencies had flourished in the borderlands. And when the Than Shwe regime took over, they wanted to build railways in the same way that the British had done, really, to help the military to defeat insurgencies and to expand state control into the borderlands. So railways were built down into the deep south, into Tanintharyi region, up towards the Indian border, towards Chin State, through Shan State and down into Kaya. And the point was to expand state control, which effectively meant military control. And they did this by effectively replicating techniques that were used by the British colonialists. So the British were the first in Myanmar, and this is what the second section of the book is really about. It continues the story of the junta's railway expansion, but it also looks back at this earlier period. And when the British invaded Burma, they found this vast country full of jungles where the only way to get around was on these narrow waterways and jungle paths. And the British were really at a military disadvantage because they didn't know these routes like the Burmese did. And so they very quickly started building railways and rounding up huge numbers of people to build the railways for them. And then they'd shuttle their troops to an advancing front line. And they built this backbone of the network, which is a 700-mile line all the way from Yangon up to Machina in the north. And the point of this and this story of continuity is kind of to reframe the story in Britain. There's a narrative that the British developed Myanmar and the military undid this. In fact, it's a story of continuity, of violent state expansion. But the book also tells another and hopefully more hopeful story of civilian resistance. And the third and final part of the book sets up the conflict between the armed forces and civilians in Myanmar that's been playing out since the coup.
Yeah, and maybe before we get to that, also there were a lot of, there were at least some kind of planned railways that were envisioned for various reasons and never built. Even some of the railways that were built never achieved their goals. Could you maybe give us some examples of this in Burma? And maybe they will point to a Burma that could have been, and how these railways might have maybe changed things?
When I was researching British railway building in Burma, the interesting thing was that most of the source material, probably 90% of it, related to railways that were never built. Pretty much as soon as the railway itself was invented, before the Third Anglo-Burmese War, before Britain had deposed the Burmese king, there were all of these surveys trying to connect British India through Burma to the east, to Thailand, which was then Siam, and to China. So there was one railway in the far south across what's known as the Kra Isthmus, which would have provided a very short route across to Thailand that would have been an alternative to the shipping route through the Malacca Straits, which is still a really important shipping route today. And then the big one that the British were trying to build, which was across the country to the Chinese interior to open up the landlocked southwestern provinces in China. Any of these railways would have dramatically changed things for Myanmar, whose modern history has been shaped more than anything else by its isolation. And geography plays a really important part in this. Myanmar is surrounded by these impenetrable mountain ranges, and pretty much all of the surveys found that a railway would be too difficult, too expensive to build. And sometimes when construction companies were brave enough to start building, they ended up having to give up, which is why you have these kind of isolated railheads at places like Lashio that are about 100 miles from the Chinese border and then nothing beyond that. And it's this geography, again, that's continuing to play an outsized role in stopping China's plans to building a railway through a chain of towns in central Myanmar to the Indian Ocean coast.
Yeah, right. And, if someone was coming at trains in Asia broadly today without a lot of background context, if they were looking at the region, it would seem pretty strange that Myanmar has some of the slowest, worst trains in the world. But it has a massive border with its neighbour, the People's Republic of China, which now is well known as having the fastest and the most high-speed rail of any country in the world. So this is still an ongoing project, right? There are still dreams to link up China with with Myanmar, and it's happened throughout Laos, for example, in our lifetimes. What's the likelihood of that particular dream ever happening, and how would a train line link with China in the current political situation potentially change the trajectory of the country?
China clearly very, very much wants this railway to be built. And while surveys were initially done, I think, in the 1990s, and then deals were signed and cancelled and signed and cancelled, and that's gone on and off for 30 years after that. In the meantime, China has been steadily building a railway to Myanmar's border. And they've been battling with the same geography that's been a problem throughout Myanmar's history. But they've persevered at huge expense, and this railway has been referred to as the world's most difficult by Chinese media. And when they get to the border, they will put extreme pressure on whoever's in charge of Myanmar to let them continue building it to the Indian Ocean, because China has a two-ocean policy and it needs access to the Indian Ocean because it feels very vulnerable with its current shipping routes. This, for Myanmar, I think it's likely to benefit outsiders much more than it will benefit the people whose land it has passed through. If we look at Chinese investment in the past, it tends to mean land confiscation, it tends to mean militarization, it tends to mean more efficient markets, which means quicker extraction of resources. And I think while there might be tangential benefits to communities in the places that the railways pass through, the history of railway building in Myanmar by outsiders, whether it's by the British colonial government or by Myanmar's military generals in the border areas, or now by the Chinese state, is not a happy one. And I don't think we're likely to see that change with this new high-speed line.
We've sort of referred to a little bit the complexities of the conflict environment. And you talk about how the trains that were built by particularly the Than Shwe regime in that era were really important to the Myanmar military in extending, we can call it sort of state control, but just also military capacity, the number of bases, the amount of area that could be quickly deployed to by troops, things like that. However we call what's happening now, the anti-coup resistance movement or the Burma military state's efforts to hold on to what it perceives to be the Union of Myanmar, how important are trains to what's happening now, to these several fronts of conflict in Myanmar?
Railways are definitely less important in winning wars in Myanmar than they once were under British rule, and then during the Second World War, when they were absolutely critical on both sides, and right up until the 90s, because until the 90s, when Myanmar's roads were improved with the use of forced labour, then most long-distance travel in the country was by train, and trains were a critical part of the military supply lines. Now, obviously, both Myanmar soldiers and resistance fighters can use the roads, and the road networks are pretty good. And roads are obviously more democratic than railways, and that makes the conflict more equal. But railways are still an important part of the equation because you can move a lot of heavy equipment, a lot of stores and troops quickly and essentially cheaply. And that is why you've seen resistance groups blowing up the tracks all over the country since the coup.
And in your conversations with people in and around some of these more sensitive train lines, it seems like there was a huge amount of obfuscating the purposes of the train lines. There's several incidents in the book where you're talking to people and you're like, okay, well, the train seems to be full of military people. It was a military project. Is this train line helpful for the military? And people just say, no. But then when you speak with local people, they're a lot more clear-eyed about what the train line has actually meant for those communities and those locations. And you tell a lot of stories there. I thought maybe you could choose one of these, because your book is structured in such a way, you mentioned the 3 sections, but it's also structured, and we haven't said this explicitly, as a sort of travelogue. So it's told in narratives of you riding on trains and meeting people. So was there anybody who particularly stood out to you, who changed the way you thought about these trains, or about a particular train line or a dynamic in a place that you'd like to highlight in this interview?
I think I might talk about the railway line in Magwe, because Magwe always got overlooked in the discussions about the Burmese military and what it was doing in the ethnic states. And I think that it was broadly believed that there was support for the military regime in what was seen as the heartland. And since the coup, we've very clearly seen that that's not the case, because some of the fiercest fighting has taken place along this railway line and places where I went along that line. And there was really no information at all about what had happened with this railway line, which was built along the western bank of the Irrawaddy River and the Ayeyarwaddy. And the state-owned newspapers, the New Light of Myanmar, claimed that it was supposed to put the western bank, which was poorer than the eastern bank, on a better socioeconomic footing. And it seemed like a relatively uninteresting railway line. It turned out that this line was probably built to connect the military's weapons factories, which were all on this side of the river, because they were moved from Yangon to places that the military saw as more secure. And they'd built this railway line straight through hundreds of villages that were on the banks of the river, where the river, all of the streams flowed into the river through these villages, in immensely complex waterways. And the military had just hired these terrible contractors, paid them very little. The contractors had done a terrible job. They built this huge bank of earthwork, and it had blocked the flow of the river, of all of these streams into the river. And it meant that the year the railway was built, and every year after that, there was huge flooding that destroyed thousands, if not tens of thousands of acres of farmland, rendered all of the people who farmed it destitute, destroyed villages, and in the worst cases, killed people. And I remember going to this tiny little village where they'd been worried about the flow of the water, and the contractors had just bored this hole in the bank that allowed the water to flow through, but the water flowed straight into their village, and it had created this huge chasm through the village that was 6 or 7 feet deep. And every monsoon, the water would flow through it, and they'd be absolutely terrified because their houses were getting closer and closer to this very fast running water. And we stood on the side of it, kind of looking at it, this bizarre scene, this village kind of split apart. And I'd said, have there been any accidents? And everyone had gone very quiet. And then the village head said, yes, Nyandin Mong, 7 years old, he drowned. And somebody else said, we lost our treasure. And it was this tiny young boy, and he'd been trying to get to school, and he'd fallen into the fast-flowing water, and he hadn't been able to swim against the current. And that story came out in a village of 60 people, because I'd happened to ask a very specific question about a railway and the impact of that railway line. And you've got to think, you're asking this question about one thing, you start asking a question maybe about a road or something else, and something equally devastating has happened. And all of this cumulatively over the years meant that in 2015, every single seat in Magwe region in the local parliament had gone to Aung San Suu Kyi's party. And since the coup, you've just seen the most fierce of resistances. I mean, you've seen it across the country, but in Magwe, it's been particularly fierce. And I think, it becomes, after all of those years, just too much for anyone to bear.
Yeah, that was a very touching moment in the book. And like I said before, not the only one. You talked to so many communities that were affected by these railways. But armed with that, and armed with, like you said, this is just one small village, one small moment. Imagine potentially how many of these there were, and whether they ever went up the chain. So as well as talking to these people, you also attempt to go right to the top. You even try to get an interview with Dan Shui and, people like that. So when you put some of the accusations or suppositions about forced labour and maybe some of the negative sides of these railways to the Lugis, as it were, what happened?
They were very surreal interviews, particularly my interview, which I talk about at the end of the book, with David Abel, who was actually the son of a Burma Railways engineer. He came from a railway family, and he was in charge of Than Shui's a whole bunch of different economic ministries. And he was old, but he stonewalled me. I mean, they all did. And they'd just say, nothing happened, it wasn't important, people were paid. They were so used to this impunity. And the fact that they'd done all of these things and then, in a way, they were rewarded for it with the opening up of the country and with business deals. And David Abel was running a consultancy business, and he was dealing with companies from all around the world. And he was extremely comfortable, and he had no reason to answer my questions. And so, of course, he didn't. And the same was true with Ong Min, who was the railway minister over much of the period that I was writing about. They were very polite, but they weren't going to answer any difficult questions.
Did you meet anybody and talk to them about the post-1990s train line who said, this train line was a wonderful thing that made things better for me or my village?
No. There are benefits to railway transport, and there were lots of people who were using the trains, which indicates that they were useful. I think the book doesn't set out to disprove that. It just sets out to talk about the fact that the harms were much, much greater than the subsidiary benefits of taking your produce to market, which, wonderfully, the trains were always packed full of people who were doing just that.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So we've talked about a few different cohorts of people here, but some people who maybe have a vested interest in the trains are the drivers. People who drive trains every day, people who love trains. It's their lifeblood. So you must have met several train drivers in Burma. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about who these people are. What kind of person becomes a train driver in today's Myanmar?
When I first set out on my journey, I was told that most Myanmar railway staffs were veterans, military veterans. And I think that was definitely the case to a degree. There's a magazine for railway staff, a monthly magazine, and it contains poetry, obviously, it's Myanmar, and stories, including one that I found really moving, which was about a young army officer who was wounded in battle and his life was falling apart until Win Sein, the former railway minister who had been his company commander, found him a job on the railways. And this happened a lot. But I think that the skilled workers, the engineers, the drivers, they were mostly from railway families. And so many of them would tell me that their fathers and even their grandfathers had worked for the department. A lot of them were Burmese, as was the way with the government as a whole. But lots of them were also of Indian descent, and their grandparents, their grandfathers had moved to Burma when it was part of the British Empire to work for the railway department then. And this is especially true on the old main lines, Mandalay, Machina, places like that. Learning to work on the railways obviously isn't easy, particularly being something like a train driver and working with such ancient equipment. And so most of the staff that I met on my journey when Myanmar was being run by the National League for Democracy had also worked for the former military regime. They were paid very, very little. Most of them had jobs on the side, but they were also really proud of the work that they did. And I was always invited into the engine room, so to sit beside them while they showed me how they operated the levers and all of those kinds of things. So this and the fact that they had worked for the military regime before and that at least some of them were veterans makes it all the more astonishing that after the coup, it was railway staff along with medics who led the civil disobedience movement. I think something like 90% of them stopped working. And I think that really reflects the depth of feeling across Myanmar after the coup against a return to military rule.
Yeah, and the ones who have either stayed in CDM or have gone back to driving trains, huge number of challenges in either path that they take. And, so even just traveling on these trains, it's clear from the stories you tell in the book was a challenge for you. Like, it wasn't a simple thing to get a ticket, get onto a train, sleep somewhere when you get off the train. So there are so many challenges associated with writing this book. But, I want to know, what was the biggest challenge for you? Because traveling on the trains was just one part of this much longer process. You have to write all this stuff down. You have to decide what you want to say. So for you, what was it? What was the biggest challenge in this excellent achievement?
It was tough. There were moments that I really didn't want to be there. There's a bit in the book where I'm following this old railway line on the Kachin border, and me and the guy who's driving me end up being detained by a Kachin soldier who is quite intoxicated and hostile. And there were moments like that when I thought, what on earth am I doing? And why am I going around the country asking this question? Why was this railway built? Why was this railway built? And at times it seemed like the whole thing was insane, frankly. But then getting back to Yangon and having a huge stack of notebooks that I felt really did add up to something was great. I think one of the hardest things was sitting in the British Library and reading back through the archives about what Britain did in Myanmar. Because we're really taught in Britain that we've always been a force for good in the world. I feel quite foolish saying this, but it's what I learned as I grew up. And even though I knew that this wasn't the case, and I'd been living in Myanmar and Hong Kong before that, and I'd sort of seen the world that Britain had left behind, I think the grisly details of what the military campaigns, what the soldiers had done. There's a bit in a book by another Burmese historian who describes reading the diaries of British soldiers as like reading the diaries of a professional arsonist. And you see in what they're doing, what Myanmar's military is doing today, and those parallels are really devastating. So I definitely found that sort of long process of unlearning hard. Useful, but hard.
Yeah, I can relate to that in the sense of being an Australian and often hearing from colonialism's defendants, the people here didn't even have wheels, that's the sort of thing. So, but what they did have is an incredible society, an incredible way of managing the land, culture, values that we've lost if we ever had them, settler colonials in Australia, which is my culture. But all of that has taken so long, and it's still taking a long time to get through. But in a settler colonial culture, education moves a lot faster, and I think, whereas when you're in an imperial centre in late sort of decline, it's a whole different story. But as well, you've also mentioned the joys and the fun of doing this project. So I want to ask you the opposite. What was the funnest thing, and what are you going to miss the most about this period in your life when you gave birth to this book, which is going to be there, it's going to outlive you for centuries?
I'm going to miss the whole thing. I'm feeling quite bereft. I mean, I had this most extraordinary transformative journey that took me to places that I never would have gone. And I met the most extraordinary array of people who taught me so much about the world. And now here I am sitting in London, commuting to work on a train, and learning very little. And so, yeah, I'm going to need to think about what's next.
Our last question on Myanmar Musings is always for our guest to give a recommendation to our listeners. Maybe you can punch a ticket on a particular line and give a recommendation. It doesn't have to be a book. It can be anything.
This is quite a broad recommendation. But whenever I've been trying to understand something in Myanmar, and I've already alluded to this, I've turned to poetry. And there's a brilliant anthology in English edited by Coco Thet called Bones Will Crow, which, if you haven't read it, and I'm sure many of your readers will have done, then it's a great place to start. Sorry, I'm sure many of your listeners will have done. I think what I'd recommend is a selection of poems entitled Train a Coming, Poems from the Burmese Resistance, which includes a poem by Pandora, which she really kindly gave permission for me to reproduce at the end of the book. And she talks about how after the coup, people lay down on the tracks in Mandalay and Molomian and elsewhere to prevent the army supply trains from running. And it was a demonstration more broadly that the state in Myanmar, including its railways, belonged not to the military, but to the people. And there's a particularly moving line in the poem, and all of the poems in this collection are very moving. And Pandora writes, we won't return to the old station. We'll march to a new future with new tickets in our hands. Then the train will roar. That line really, really got me.
Yeah, that's very nice. I haven't heard of that one either. I did notice it in the book, but I hadn't heard of it. So that's a really great recommendation. And I recommend that people read the book, of course. So again, it's On the Shadow Tracks, A Journey Through Occupied Myanmar, Allen Lane Publishing this year. If you're in the UK, you can pick up autographed copies from certain stores, or you can order online, and you probably can get it delivered nearly everywhere in the world. So thank you so much, Claire, for coming on Myanmar Musings, and final congratulations on your awesome book. If anybody's in Chiang Mai, I think you'll be here doing an event August 1st, is that right? And the day before that Chiang Mai event in Bangkok at the FCCT, there will also be an event where Claire will be discussing the book. And thank you again so much.
Thank you so much. I had a lovely time.